right, Matthew chapter 5 today. We're going to look at verses 33 to 37. We're working our way through this series of statements, if you recall. This is the heart and soul of this sermon, really falls in line with these 6 statements that Jesus uses in contrast, each one beginning with that simple phrase, "You have heard it said by men of old." In each of these cases, he then says, "This is what you understand, now let me expand that and tell you what you should know." Matthew, this is a unique gospel in that regard, and the Sermon on the Mount is really the highlight of this gospel. This is the core of it. And if it's so important, you almost have to ask, why is it that only Matthew has such an extensive run of this sermon? If this really is a key moment in the ministry of Jesus, why is it only in this one gospel that we get this very complete view of that? Why is it so either ignored entirely or kind of glossed over? Well, I want you to understand things. We didn't do something that I normally do. Normally when we start a book, we start in chapter 1, verse 1, and I give you the structure of the book so that you know how the setting is going to go. I give you kind of an overview. And since we started in just doing a one section, you didn't get that benefit. But each gospel has a unique structure to it. Each one has a unique audience in mind. And Matthew has a particular audience. Now, who do you think this is written to? Jews or Gentiles? Jews. It's written to Jews. It is most definitely written to a Jewish audience here. And Matthew approaches it with that in mind. So I want you to understand something. Luke is the other gospel that has really a section on the Sermon on the Mount. And there it's pretty much glossed over. As a matter of fact, you have the Beatitudes, but you really don't have this whole section where it says, "You have heard it said by men of old." As a matter of fact, if you turn over to that one, Luke, I'll give you a different idea of who Luke is writing to. Now, Luke is our only Gentile writer in the New Testament. And Luke is writing to Gentiles. In the very first chapter, here's what he says. Notice what his approach is. "Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. Therefore, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, it seemed good to me to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things you have been taught." Do you understand his take here? Luke is approaching this as a scholar. He's an historian. And what Luke says is, I've gone in and I've looked at the facts and I'm going to lay this out. And notice that name is not a Jewish name of who he's writing to. It's Greeks. So when Luke comes to the Sermon on the Mount, looking here, I believe in chapter 7 here, if I'm not mistaken, blessing and woes, blessed are you poor. Yeah, that's in chapter 6. It actually starts here. Down there in verse 20, looking to his disciples, he says, he does the Beatitudes, but I want you to note something. He comes to the Beatitudes, and then he pops over here, and then very good. "But I tell you," starting in verse 27, he says that woe to you and woes. He says, "But I tell you." Notice nothing about this. "You have heard it said by men of old." Why does he leave that out for his audience? They haven't heard any of this stuff. None of their men of old said this stuff. It was Jewish men of old who said this stuff. In Luke's world, there was nothing that was a reference point for them. Understand several of these, most especially the one we're looking at today, this whole idea of oaths and your word meaning something, would have had no point of reference for a Gentile audience. They had no idea what it meant to swear by the temple, to swear by the throne of God, to swear by your head. They were, what is he even talking about? So what does Luke draw out of all of these and focus on? Notice what he says here, "But I tell you who hear me, love your enemies." What's the one reference point that everybody would certainly get as far as a contrast between how they thought and what Jesus was teaching? Has everybody had an enemy at some time in life? Whether you wanted one or not, whether you wanted to make one or not. And can you think of any greater contrast between how the world thinks and this one that says, "Love your enemies and do good for those who hate you"? Does this really come to the core of how different the character that Jesus is bringing out is than how we live in everyday life? So I love the critics always come and say, here's the proof that these Gospels all came from different sources. They're a collection of different ideas. They contradict each other. No. Each writer understands their audience. And in understanding their audience, when they look at the teaching of Jesus, they say, what should I focus on? Also, each writer has an audience in mind and a point in mind that they're trying to make, and they say, how do I make that point? John is after what? Do you remember what John's main theme was? Christ is God. Jesus is God. He is proving the divinity. He is focusing on that. And his whole gospel is only really, the bulk of it is about the last few weeks of the life of Jesus. Luke is an historian writing to a people who had no framework, and so he writes a different style. Matthew is a book about Jews. And I want you to understand here, the whole thing that Matthew is after here is, quite frankly, an indictment of their failure to understand who Jesus was. Luke is looking, you have no point of reference. But when Matthew looks at his audience, he says, what's the one thing you guys should have known the second this guy opened his mouth?
Messiah.
This is the Messiah. How did you miss this? There's a bite to Matthew. There's a real bite to this. There's an indictment in it. And this whole section where he chooses these 6 contrasting statements are really that point where the anger starts to come through. How did you miss this? How did you twist this so severely that you changed the teaching of God from the Old Testament that was entrusted to you? Understand that setting. It is one thing to be ignorant. It is one thing not to have heard anything. Ignorance is not bliss, it's bad. And Luke is solving ignorance. It's another thing to be told that truth, to have distorted that truth, and then had structured that distortion into a line of teaching that meant you were telling people generation after generation a lie about the truth that had been entrusted to you. Is the Bible rather picky about getting it right? You ever pick up on that there may be something that God kind of wanted his word handled in a certain way? Old Testament prophet. What was the standard for an Old Testament prophet?
100% accurate.
100% accurate. Or you die. That seems rather final, doesn't it? I would suggest that the office was not often sought after by anyone rather lightly unless they thought they could pull off something carefully done. It was changed in that. Remember that James talks in the New Testament. It says this, there should not be many teachers among you. Why?
Standard of judgment.
There's a higher standard of judgment for you. What judgment? Based on what?
Handling the truth process.
Getting it right. Paul, who makes the command, study to show yourself approved. Study what? God's Word. And to be approved, what you have to do to be approved? Study it and get it right. We come to the very last book, and John writes the last book and says, if you want to mess with any of this, God doesn't have a problem at all. Update it anytime you need in new generations, play with it, move it around, because God wants you to be able to make it relevant for the next generation.
There you go, that odd translation.
That's, yes, an odd translation. No, it's rather final, isn't it? If you add to any of this, if you detract from any of this, God will add to you the plagues of this book, and he will detract you from the promises of God. Rather final in its approach. This is what we're picking up on here. This is what we're after, and I want you to understand. When we come to this section, it is blown up into this full thing. So much more of the sermon is recorded here because the audience should have been prepared for this. And so Matthew really goes into this in depth. He picks up on themes and things that Luke never touched. So I want you to understand, here's the structure of the book of Matthew. It breaks into 3 basic themes for the entire book of Matthew. 3 things run through this. First thing is the revelation of the king. Matthew is making a case to a Jewish audience and telling them, these are the things you always were taught about the Messiah. Did you notice that they happen to line up with this guy named Jesus? And he has a beginning point. How does Matthew begin? What did the king have to be in order to have the right to the throne?
Correct lineage.
Correct lineage. Had to be the heir of David. Guess where Matthew begins? The lineage. There you go. This is in the line of David. He has the right of birth to this throne. He is the one that belongs here. He has a claim. And isn't it interesting that when Matthew opens, that some people immediately understood this, and it was the wrong people. Because guess who the first one who recognized that this guy being born was there to be king? And he didn't like the idea. Remember who that was? Herod. The Jews missed it, but Herod immediately said, this is the guy they've been talking about. The Jews have been waiting for this guy forever. He's going to come and take
My job.
my job. And so Herod does what?
Kills him.
Kill him.
He tries to kill all the boys in his generation and say, why don't we just stop this thing right here? From out of town come 3 guys who are going to anoint a king. They're the kingmakers. They are coming to bring kingly gifts and say, this is the rightful heir. They come from out of town and arrive to announce this and make it there. Satan knew who it was. Remember his response? I'll try to tempt him and subvert him. I'll try to twist this whole thing so he doesn't get the throne in the right way. I'll work it out. Did Jesus leave any doubt in the way he approached the story? As you walk through Matthew, Jesus makes it very plain. There's a power to it. There's a difference in this. As he enters Jerusalem, he enters in a royal procession. I mean, he doesn't just sneak into town and tell stories. He comes in knowing he's fulfilling prophecies that make the declaration, I promised you a Messiah, and here I am. He laid it out in plain terms. The things that happen, we see Jesus is announced by the last of the Old Testament prophets. We hear the very voice of God from heaven say,
This is my son.
this is my son in whom I am well pleased. That seems rather dramatic, doesn't it? I mean, if you're standing around and a voice from heaven echoes that, and you understand they did not have the special effects we have today, that kind of stands out. So when Matthew comes to this sermon, he's saying, how did you miss this? This is what he's laying out here. The claim to authority is what he's after here as well. And we've made this point. Understand, no rabbi, no Pharisee, no prophet of God ever said, here's what it said, here's what you say about it, and now I'm going to set you straight, and there's no debate on this. That isn't done. No one ever claimed that level of authority. Remember how the rabbis always did things? How was their debate done?
In the synagogue, when they talk.
They came in the synagogue and they cited their sources. You know, I'm going to line up these 9 super rabbis you all respect that all agree with me. Well, I have 17 who agree with me. And Jesus comes in and says, I don't care who agrees with me or doesn't. I say, I'm not citing anybody. I'm going to tell you this is exactly what it means, and we're not even going to debate it. I'm not going to listen to your rebuttal to this whole point. I'm not setting a premise that we're going to test. He just lays it out. Now, that's the first theme. The first theme is, this is the guy, and everyone should have seen it. You know what the second theme of Matthew is? That everybody rejected the obvious heir to the throne. The rejection is the big. His very birth is almost rejected by his earthly father, who looks and says, well, I'm going to have to put her away. Something's awfully off here, and it's wrong. Herod commits the slaughter of children to stop it. Jesus has no honor in his hometown. Remember that? He makes that comment. He grows up in a town clearly different than anybody else, and how does the town treat him? There is no revival in his hometown. You understand that? All of his followers came from other places as he left. Where he grew up, where everyone saw the character of a man perfect, no response of any kind occurs there. That's rather unique. Matthew has the darkest cross moment of anyone. Not that you could have a bright cross moment, but I want you to understand this. When it comes to the cross, there is nothing there about the thief that is hanging next to Jesus. There is no redemptive moment talked about in here. There is none of the things in the crowd where someone offers to make comments as this was obviously the Son of God. There's nothing there that talks about the person offering a drink. None of the kindness, none of the things you see from his disciples is in Matthew. It is all the rejected Christ, who then has that heart-rending moment when he looks to his own father, who says, no, I'm not going to help you now either. It's dark, it's tragic, and it's a shame on the Jews that he's after here. What does come in Matthew is this. There's a third theme, and that's the promised return of the King. And running all through this, Matthew always goes back to this hopeful note, making it plain, yes, you all had to know who he was. Yes, overwhelmingly you rejected him, but it isn't going to matter. At some point he's going to return, and even his enemies are going to have to give him his due, whether they want to or not. It isn't going to help them at that point, but it's going to come a time when everyone has to recognize who he is. I mean, even from the cross, he predicts his reign. That's the themes that run through and structure this book. And that's why when we come to this is where the bite comes, because Jesus is condemning a group of leaders whose job it was to read the scripture, to get it right, and prepare the people for this moment. And instead of Jesus being able to say, yes, you've been taught about this, you should all recognize me because you've been taught this properly for your entire lives, he has to stop here and say, you've been taught wrong for all these generations, and I have to undo everything you've heard up to this point. That's the anger and that's the indictment they have here. How far had they gotten from the Old Testament understanding? We've looked at this very carefully. What had they replaced God's word with? Man's word, their own legal system. Understand why Jesus is so upset. When you go from what the Old Testament tried to teach to what they had, you had created a system that said this: I can, through my efforts, redeem myself and make myself good enough before God to enter heaven. Now, what does that make you?
God.
Your own Savior. It makes you God. It makes you God. This is the anger Jesus has for any system of religion based upon works, because it replaces God with a human Savior. And in most cases, that human Savior is yours. I want you to try this. From the Mormon faith, not only do they have a work system, but if you remember, they believe they can achieve the status and become gods themselves. They can get their own world. Now, that sounds silly to you, but I want you to think, isn't that the logical outgrowth of a work system? If you can redeem yourself, if you can make yourself perfect, who have you become? In their structure, it makes perfect sense. I'll become the next god of the next world. I'll work my way up just like the other ones did, and I'll be a creator someday too.
Unless you're a woman, then you just get to be eternally pregnant.
Then you got to be, well, yes, they do have a dual system there, I have to understand. As did the Jews, as we saw with their divorce laws. Some of us can become gods, the rest will serve us. What greater ego builder is there than that? Yeah, John?
Well, there are even some within the realm of so-called Christianity that believe you can reach sinless perfection.
Yep.
As well.
A group called Pentecostal Holiness believes that there is a progression of moving up through the life in Jesus until you become a person who never sins, who does not sin. Can you imagine the level of pride for anyone to be able to look at themselves and honestly evaluate and say, I am sinless?
That was their first sin.
Right there. But I just, can you imagine? I get the level of blindness here because they had reduced it to a legal set, and as long as you look at the list and kept the list, they thought they were perfect. But any evaluation that you talk about now, I mean, in the Pentecostal holiness, they definitely do not have just that super list. So how did they arrive here? How do you get to that point where you do an assessment of your heart and say, I've arrived. It doesn't get better than me. That's quite the moment. So I want you to understand that. Jesus is compelling them. He's indicting them here in these 6 statements by contrasting the truth with what they were being taught. He's going to end this out. If you remember in 548, it says, here's the standard you missed. You're supposed to be perfect. You're supposed to be perfect. And in all honesty, you know you can't be. Human conduct can't achieve that. So each of these is a contrast in that light, in that understanding of the structure of this book. Now here's the one we come to, and this one's going to sound a little weird to you. I want you to bear with me till we get to the end of this, because this one may be a little hard to sort out. But notice this, starting in verse 33. Again, you have heard it said by men of old, Do not break your oath, but keep the oaths you have made to the Lord. But I tell you, do not swear at all, either by heaven, for it is God's throne, or by the earth, or by his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great God. And do not swear by your head, for you cannot even make one hair white or black. Simply let your yes be yes, and your no, no. Anything beyond that comes from the evil one. This is a strange section. If you don't understand the structure and what's going on here, I want you to understand the importance of this. Jesus is focusing on the one thing that is the hardest for a person to control more than anything else in their life: your mouth. Speech. James rolls that at us, that speech is a rather important thing. Looking at James chapter 1 and verse 26 here, he lays that out. If anyone considers himself religious and yet does not keep a light rein on his tongue, he deceives himself, and his religion is worthless. Get that? If you can't control your mouth, nothing else really matters. Chapter 3, verse 2 in James goes after the same idea. We all stumble many ways. If anyone is never at fault in what he says, he is a perfect man, able to keep his whole body in check. Now that seems like a bold statement, doesn't it? But stop and think, what is the hardest thing to rein in your entire life? Any other sin? You're at that moment, you're mad at somebody, and I take a good look and go, he looks a little bigger than I want to try, maybe I'll show some restraint. So I'm not going to get physical. But what can I always lash out with and figure I can get away with it?
Verbal.
Oh, I can always get a few words in. Even as if I mutter them as I head to the car just ahead of him before he can respond, I can get something in there. I can make that last shot. We always have something we have to say.
That's why they tell you to bridle your tongue.
You bridle your tongue, got to put that bit in your mouth. It may sound silly, but understand this. What is the hardest thing to also do? And that is to make truth come out of your mouth every time you speak. Because what are men born as? All of us.
Liars.
Liars. We lie by nature. How do we know that? Because none of us has ever had to teach our children how to do that. We've had to train ourselves to spot it when they do. But none of us has ever had to work at that. We never had to wonder, where do they pick that up? We know it's coming. I find that one of the biggest indictments of this world's view of things, that we're not born with sin. Every parent, whether saved or unsaved, knows the child is going to lie. It's built into them.
Liar.
Yes.
Phone's not recording anymore.
What happened,
I
right?
think it is.
Phased out.
Oh, it's still recording. It's still recording, but low battery alert.
It's plugged in all night. We may not get this one, so we may have two gaps. So it's a good thing you're here today. So now I have to rush through this last one, get it done in what, 7 minutes? So we can. Yes. Lying is so common to us that we have special categories for it. We have special things that we deal with. Try this. Aren't there certain classifications of people in the world that we just assume if they hold this position, they're going to lie to us? Politicians, we always run there.
Lawyers.
Used car salesman.
There you go.
Life insurance salesman.
Life insurance sales, it's almost salesmen in general. I feel bad for any honest person that ever held a position in one of these categories. Because the second you say what you do, the assumption of 99% of the people around you is, you're a liar. You're going to lie about this. A society, you can judge a lot from a society by the number of words they have to describe something. This is the old thing that always comes up. The Eskimos have a ton of words for snow. Think about the number of words we have for lying.
Fib.
A fib. What do we mean by fib? Why do we use the fib?
Just a little one.
It's just a little one. It's not a big deal.
It's a white lie.
A white lie. There's another one we like to use, a white lie. We think that it's a white lie. It's meant for the best reasons. I'm lying for a good cause.
That's right, it's justified.
It's justified in some way. I've got some way out. I may have lied, but I'm not guilty. Stretch the truth. To stretch the truth. Now, what do we mean by that one?
Like bending the truth too.
Yeah, the truth is in there just a little bit, and maybe I made it up, but it's true. It was true. It was mostly true. I love the other word you just said. There's no exaggeration. Exaggeration means I lied to you. I didn't tell you the whole story. I gave you part of it. Spinning a yarn. Hyperbole. I like that one. My favorite now is the one we used because we don't want to sound bad. He was somewhat disingenuous. Somewhat disingenuous, yes.
We also call it their own truth now.
That has come now. Yeah, we all have our own truth. And truth means whatever I want it to mean. Yeah, exaggeration, fabrication, white lies, half-truths, misleading statements. Oh, that's good. Yeah, you see what
Irritating.
Sometimes we omit the most important thing that we should say, and that makes it a lie.
Omission. Yeah, prevarication. There's one that sounds very highbrow. Doesn't it? It was prevarication. What does it mean? It means I lie. That's what it means.
Deceit.
I have found in our culture that generally speaking, if I find a person shouting, angry at the top of their lungs, saying how important the truth is, that they are the least likely person to be telling me the truth that I'm going to run into today. And that is that when they're all wound up about it, truth is not in their wheelhouse. It just isn't there. There's a need for that. There's an understanding for that. We even entertain ourselves with it. The show was on for years, The Island, the whole thing, where you get kicked off it. Watch the people as they manipulate and lie to one another to avoid being kicked off the island. When I was little, there was a show called this, To Tell the Truth.
Yeah.
Remember that show?
Yeah.
There was a panel of different major stars that sat there, and you would bring in 3 people, and one of them would be telling the truth. And the other 2 wouldn't. And the whole show was based around trying to figure out who was telling the truth.
My dad was on that show.
Was he?
As himself. Yeah. It's funny.
Did they catch him, or did they pick someone else? Because I've seen a number of times they pick another person.
I don't know, but we clean out their house and have them move. We'll probably find it.
Yeah, you go.
No, it's that film. But yeah, that's funny.
Funny show. But wouldn't it be nice if when someone said something, you immediately knew it was true? That you could trust it. Trust is a really important commodity to us. Daniel Webster said this: there's nothing as powerful as the truth. I like this. The rabbis said there were 4 things that cut us off from God. And they made this list: scoffing, hypocrisy, slander, and lying. Now I find it interesting because really all of those are lying. Scoffing is bringing down someone's credibility by just not addressing the truth, just making them sound small. The whole idea of hypocrisy is to put on a show that isn't true. Slander, telling a lie about someone. They understood it, but they didn't get it.
Was that Jewish leaders that said that?
Yeah, that was the rabbis had broken it down to scoffing, hypocrisy, slander, and lying. So I want to look at some things here. We're going to look at Mosaic law, what's really said about oaths and other things, Jewish tradition, and divine teaching. We need to understand those and what developed in these. What was an oath in the Old Testament? I'll give you a simple definition of what Jesus is talking about. An oath was this: a declaration made before God about the truth of a promise or statement. An oath called upon God to invoke a curse on the person making the statement should the statement prove false or if they fail to make good on the promise. An oath was made before God. Now understand this, the oath was made because it established responsibility for failure to be telling the truth. It puts you on trial before God that God should punish you if you didn't do this. Can you think of a setting that we have practiced this where that oath is held, that we make a person say an oath knowing they're going to be held accountable if they're lying? Courtroom. Remember how that one goes? I promise to tell the truth. But we're not happy with that because we know they'll lie. So what's the next line? The whole truth and nothing but the truth. Why all the extra verbiage? Because they're looking for a loophole. The person will lie if they don't have to say, you know what, I'll tell the truth. Well, yeah, I'll tell the whole truth. I won't hold, and nothing but the truth. So I won't even put anything to try to twist it or move it around. And if they don't do that, what can we hold them accountable for?
Contempt.
Perjury or contempt. We can go two different things.
Not that too many people are held by that.
That's the truth.
Yeah.
But it's supposed to have these things. This used to be the common phrase at a wedding. Do you promise before God and these witnesses? Because there was supposed to be an accountability to that oath you were taking before God and these witnesses. That you really meant this. I don't see that in weddings too much anymore, but that's supposed to be there. We add these statements for the simple point of saying, this time I really mean it. And again, doesn't that tell you something about the culture? That we need some extra verbiage to be sure the person's serious about it this time. And that's what he's after here. What is the oath taken? Oaths were taken throughout the Old Testament. Isaac, Jacob, David, they all men that took oaths before God. It was a serious thing. It was so serious, and they took it so seriously, that I want you to try this one. If you were tricked into making an oath, you still had to keep it. Now, wouldn't you think, well, if I was lied to, shouldn't I have an out clause here? I want you to try this one. This is from Joshua chapter 9. We could read it in verses 3 to 19. There's a setting here. Israel's coming into the land. They have been told to do away with the people there. They can't trust them. Make no treaties with them. Make no bargains with them. You can't trust these people here. And these people hear about this and they go, we got to figure something out. Here's what they do. They go and they put on ragged clothes and shoes with holes. They cover themselves with dust. And they come up, Joshua, and they say, we have traveled many, many miles to be here. And we have heard from far about the greatness of your God. And we are come here to honor him. And we want to make a bargain with you so that we can be your friends. And they make the bargain. And it turns out they're local neighbors that are on that list that God says don't make deals with these people. And you know what? Israel made war to everybody but those people. Because once you had given your oath, it was supposed to mean something. That was how ingrained it was in that culture. You know, it used to be ingrained in American culture that way. For a period of time in the early West, when they were moving westward, a man's word absolutely was his bond. You ever wondered why it was when somebody would call you a liar, it was fighting words, and two men were ready to throw down, literally with guns? That isn't just Hollywood. There was a reason for that, and the reason was this. Many of them couldn't read. There were no courts in the Old West at that time. It wasn't happened. They hadn't civilized yet. What was the only bond you had? Your word.
You're only good as your word.
And you're only as good as your word. And if someone was to question your veracity, they didn't just insult you. They could ruin you for having a job or the ability to make a living. And so they defended that at a level that was incredible. That's what's going on here. And this is what Jesus is addressing. This is how important an oath was supposed to be. There's a statement here from Exodus 27 that says this: God will not hold guiltless one who takes his name in vain. Now, I want you to understand what he's referring to here, because most often, what do we think about when someone takes the name of God in vain? Swear words, you know. We're yelling God to damn this, and some people brave say, "Oh, Jesus Christ!" Don't say that's just wrong. How using the notes? No, those still are a bad idea. But here's what's being said here: it was to swear an oath before God to attest His name and veracity to it, and not keep your word. That was to take the Lord's name in vain. The standard was simple and well understood, and the first part is all good here. But here the rabbis played with something. They go, you know, this oath-taking, because we want people to believe us, but we don't want to be held completely accountable for what we might say. We want a loophole. So here's what they had decided. They had decided there was a whole series of ways to give an oath and sound very, very serious, but not be held accountable. And here's the thing. As long as the oath was not made in the name of God, if I use a different oath, I'm going to make a promise to you. I'm going to do this deal. This horse it's only 3 years old. You don't have to worry about what I'm selling to you. It's perfectly good. I swear by the temple of God that this horse is only 3 years old and has never had a sick day in its life. Now here's the thing. Notice what I said. I swear by the temple of God, but not by God. Turns out the horse is 7. It's got a bad leg, and you come back to me and you say, you swore an oath. Well, to the best of my knowledge, it was only 3 years old, and I did say that I only swore by the temple. So I'm sorry, but you can't hold me to that. Now, I want you to think of that. They'd come with oaths. They would swear by their head, which was supposed to be covered before God. They would swear by all these other things. It's like a kid. Remember what you did as a kid? You didn't want to keep your word? Cross your fingers. I promise. I'm telling you, all but my fingers were crossed, all but. This is how childish it had gotten. The whole thing had broken down to this whole system where the level of dishonesty was completely out of line because they had nothing but loopholes. Proverbs says, lying lips an abomination before God. Sounds rather serious. Psalms 58:3 says, lies are seen in the actions of wicked men. Psalm 119:29 says that the prayer of a righteous man is kept and will keep him from deceitful practices. In Psalm 119:163, it simply says this, a righteous man hates lies. Now, what does that say about anyone who practices anything less than telling the truth? That is what they had done. Now, then Jesus addresses this in our passage. So if that's what they were doing, what is Jesus after here? What is the divine standard? Look at again what he says. Again, you have heard it said by men of old, do not break your oath, but keep your oaths you have made before the Lord. But I tell you, do not swear at all, either by heaven or by God's throne, or by the earth, for it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for that is the city of the great king. And do not swear by your head, for you cannot even make one hair white or black. Simply let your yes be yes, and your no be no. What is he after? Your word is your bond. Now, some people say that Jesus does away with oaths entirely here, but we know that Paul takes an oath later. We know that Jesus deals with an oath. It's not saying that, but he is saying this. They had cheapened. Understand, when an oath was taken in the Old Testament, it was considered such a solemn, serious thing to do that. You're making a very serious statement. This was to make you understand that what we're doing here stands out from any other business we've conducted, anything else we've done. To bring God's name and say, I make an oath before God, was a solemn event. And Israel had turned it into something completely different. Oaths now, Jesus isn't trying to do with oaths. He's saying everything shouldn't be an oath. I would put this into our culture. You know what we have cheapened is the word crisis in our culture. Because today, everything is a crisis. We have a crisis of this. That's how politicians, this is always a thing. We have and the whole world is going to end. There's because we have a crisis. They had cheapened oaths because they were used all the time. What Jesus wants you to do is back off and remember that when you use this name, it's supposed to mean something. And try this. When you come to an oath, how much more can you trust that moment if a person has established in their daily life a simple character that says this? When I say yes, I mean yes. And when I say no, I mean no. Does that change life if those two words actually mean something? How about parenting? Do you think parenting has changed if no means no? Might have a better impact. I better not have to tell you no again. Well, why are we telling him no again? Why are we on the 7th time? Why have we had a timeout? Why have we counted to 10? Why shouldn't no have meant no?
Saves a lot of time.
Saves a bit of time. Yes. Matters. You're going to be moving. You say, can you be there? And I say,
Sure.
yes. What should you expect? But what do we expect? Do we have people in our lives that we know when they say that, the odds may be 50-50 at best? Yeah, I know they said they'd be here, but you know Bob. We know. John, but it's about maybe he will, maybe he won't. All of this has to come back to have it mean something. If there's anything I tried to establish early with my children was this whole idea of keeping your word and yes meaning something. We really drilled that home. And I've even taken some flack from friends about it that say we kind of tried to make a standard too high. But I was very careful with my words. When I said yes, they came to an understanding that meant if he's not dead on the road somewhere, if he hasn't been shot and robbed, yes means this is going to happen. I had to be very careful, and I had to add a special phrase. I'll try. Was very important to use at critical times because I had to understand that there were things out of my control. Now, I'll be honest. Yes didn't always mean yes because sometimes I bombed. But I want you to try this. What came out of this was a very good moment because being consistent enough about yes, on those rare occasions where I messed up, I was not held to a high standard where they felt I was a complete loss. It was, they said this, well, there must have been something comes up because that's very unusual for Dad. That's really unusual. And I got more forgiveness for my failures, not less, because they saw that as a unique failure that was out of character for me. And it created a much higher level of respect than I could have gotten any other way. Saying something and doing it. There is nothing that undercuts you worse than someone, are you going to handle it? Yep. And then we wonder. Are they going to do it? Will they make the call? Will they get around to it? The frustration you have, did you do it? No, I didn't. But you said you were going to. Yeah, I know, and I'm going to. What's the next thing we always ask? When? And why do we want to now pin them down to win?
Because it's really not.
Because they're not going to do it if they don't get a commitment, if they don't have an accountability, if they don't expect, if I said win by Tuesday at 2 o'clock, and if I don't do it by Tuesday at 2 o'clock, you know what he's going to do? He's going to be calling. The standard here, what Jesus has brought to bear, is indicting a culture for how it says things and why it says things and whether it means what it says. Truth matters. There is nothing more binding to establish character than a person you can believe is saying what is true, that will do what they say. I put this in my list of things when I talk to men about acting like men. And I've always said, here's my list of things you and I always say, be on time. And I put it in my list. And people have always said, well, that seems like a silly standard. I want you to understand, that's one of the most basic things. If you say, I'll be there at 9 o'clock, there's very little that says more about personal discipline than controlling your time to be there at 9 o'clock. I have an old saying that I learned from a gentleman years ago in business. Early is on time is late, and late is unacceptable. Giving yourself the leeway, it's an issue of discipline that you put into life. It's also a statement about how you feel about people. Honesty is a statement about that. If you tell someone something you don't intend to do, you are dismissing them as unimportant. I would put that to the old idea of being on time. When you say to someone, I'm going to be there at such a time, and you're not, you know who you're saying is more important than they are? I am. You'll wait on me until I'm ready to show up. Yes?
How many relative gatherings do you have where you say, we're gonna be there at this time, and it's like, well, we know they're not. They're gonna show up whenever they want.
Yeah.
You know?
And I love people I know and friends and family I have, and we usually build into our schedule that, well, we'll tell them here, but we'll really plan to begin at. Because I got to leave that, yeah, I've got to leave that in there. And I'm not saying that you're a terrible person if you have a difficulty being on time, but I am saying that it is a lack of discipline and it's a lack of care about building character. And there is a statement about a care for people that should be here. Jesus is indicting a culture that has developed lying as normal. And is that really any different than our culture right now, to be honest? That lying is normal?
And lying is a tool. We use it as a tool.
We use it as a tool, a means of getting where we need to be. Let's close that up. We'll go to questions.